Hello, everyone. Welcome to our December History Talks. The volume is very good this evening, I will say. Thank you all for joining us. So I'm going to start tonight by introducing our team this evening. My name is Felicia Rova-Cameron. I'm the Associate Curator for the Lacey Museum. I am joined by our Adjunct Curator, Dr. Olivia Moore, who will be moderating the virtual part of the presentation at the back of the room. And joining us for tonight's program is Kyle Pittman, who will be presenting on tribal sovereignty, a history of colonization and federal Indian policy. So the presentation tonight is going to be an hour in length, and then we will be holding the Q&A session afterwards. So before we begin tonight's presentation, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement and some recent museum news. The Lacey Museum is on the ancestral land of the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek, including the Nisqually Indian tribe and the Squaxin Island tribe. We acknowledge and remember those tribal people not recognized today who were absorbed or relocated into other tribes for survival. We recognize the ancestors and their descendants who are still here. We recognize and respect the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek as the traditional stewards of this land since time immemorial, and their role today in taking care of these lands in perpetuity. We recognize and have the responsibility to call attention to the histories of dispossession, forced removal, and abridged treaty rights that have allowed our nation, state, and city to develop as they have today. We recommend that community members read the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854. We are currently offering free guided tours for those interested in getting a firsthand look at the museum space before it's officially open to the public. Groups of up to 8 guests will be provided a 1-hour time slot that includes a 30 to 45-minute tour and the opportunity to browse the space independently. And you can also ask us questions about the moving process, so museum staff will be happy to help. Registration is required for this, so space is limited, so be sure to reserve your spot. And as I had mentioned last month, we do finally have an opening date. We are very excited to be back and open and welcome you all into our space Thursday, January 15th. The museum's operating hours will be Thursdays and Fridays, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., and Saturdays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. During the month of December, pick up a free Thurston County Historical Journal from us. We have some in the back of the room today, so please browse our stock. These are usually $5 each, but we're offering one free journal per person this month. We hope you'll join us next month for our January History Talks with Art Dolan for his talk titled The Greatest Breakup Letter in U.S. History, the Declaration of Independence. Moving on to tonight's presentation, as mentioned previously, we will hold our Q&A section at the end. For those in person, please raise your hand if you do have a question, and I will come over with the microphone. We do that so folks who are watching online can hear your question. And then for folks online, we have a comment box that you can ask your questions, which is usually located at the bottom of your screen. So now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Kyle Pittman. Pittman is a Nez Perce descendant and a lifelong resident of Washington State, having been raised on the Puyallup Indian Reservation in Tacoma. He currently serves as a full-time faculty member at the Evergreen State College, teaching in the Native Pathways program, where he offers classes on federal Indian law and policy, tribal governance, and American Indian histories. Thank you, Kyle, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and for people who are here joining us in person and on Zoom. Really honored to be here, to be invited by the Lacey Museum and have this opportunity to speak to y'all about, well, what I also talk about for a living. So yes, welcome to my presentation here this evening titled Tribal Sovereignty, A History of Colonization and Federal Indian Policy. As a bit of a preface to this material, I want to inform you that this is a condensed version of the content that I do teach as part of my classes at the Evergreen State College. Normally, I have 10 weeks to deliver this content, so I apologize ahead of time for the barrage of information that's coming at you, because we're going to try to fit 10 weeks into 1 hour. I promise you, though, I try to make it manageable for the format of this talk. I'll also be staying a bit afterwards, as I said, to answer questions, and I'm more than happy to continue talking with anybody should there be follow-up questions later on. Please know that my goal is not to overwhelm you with this topic. It is pretty complex, what we're going to dive into this evening. I do believe in providing thorough coverage because of the complexity in this area, though. A major reason why I provide instruction on this topic and why I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all tonight is that the notion of tribal sovereignty, the self-governing authority of tribal nations that reside in what we now call the United States, is, or at least should be, a matter that concerns every American. And the question usually after I say something like that is, well, why, right? And well, this talk will hopefully explain that why piece pretty thoroughly, but just to maybe kind of get into it a little bit, and I do like to be interactive and animated in when I'm talking to people, so you'll see a little bit of that maybe when I get really fiery or passionate, but I want to ask a question real quick. How many tribes are there in Washington State? Does anybody know? Just shout it out. 47, 29. Okay, we got 29. Yep, there are 29 federally recognized tribes in the state of Washington. That's not counting unrecognized tribes or tribes that have ancestral lands that veer into what are now the modern boundaries of Washington State. Another one, pop quiz again. How many tribes are there in the United States? 555, got 100 area, okay. Any more guesses? That's all right. 574. There are 574 federally recognized tribes. That's not counting state-recognized tribes, unrecognized tribes, or tribes that, of course, exist outside of the United States. And a lot of those tribes are actually confederacies. They are multiple tribes or bands that are recognized as a single political entity, a polity nowadays. And that includes here in Washington State. So tribes like Yakima, which I also have ancestral connection to, Colville, even tribes like Tulalip and Muckleshoot are actually considered confederacies. So they're multiple tribes. And in Washington State, we have 39 counties. So we almost have one tribe per county here in Washington State. And tribes today are consistently in the top number of employers within the state. They employ collectively more people than Costco or Walmart within the state. So I bring that out because it really hones in on the point here that tribal nations are part of this fabric of society that we live in here. They are part of the family of governments. We don't just have the federal government, the 50 state governments, the territorial governments, the local governments. We also have these 574 tribal governments that also work to provide services, that execute jurisdiction, that help facilitate business and economics. All of that touches our lives, especially in a state like ours, in some aspect, whether we know it or not. And that is why I focus on teaching about a topic like this, so people can be more informed about how tribes might actually be impacting their daily life. So with that being said, let's go ahead and we can dive into a presentation here. Kind of some of the learning goals that I hope that by the end of this, right, that we can maybe glean from as we go through this content. We're going to describe the concept of tribal sovereignty. We're going to explore how European colonization and American westward expansion shaped the development of the federal government's federal Indian policy. And we're going to provide a basic understanding for the legal concepts that underpin modern government-to-government relationships between tribal nations and the United States. So we only have 108 slides more to go. Let's do this. No. I promise it's fewer than that. It's fewer. Okay, so first thing first, I like to really frame the discussion that we're having here and kind of go back and talk conceptually, kind of talk abstractly about these points here. And the first is to talk about the idea of sovereignty and talk about politics and what these things mean and why they are the terms that we also use when we're talking about tribal nations. So the term politics, the phrase politics, is something that I'm sure we hear a lot nowadays, right? You might hear that when someone calls something political, or someone has a particular position, or they express opinion. Someone says, oh, that's really political, how you're expressing that. But sometimes I think that also really confuses what we mean when we say something is political, something has to do with politics. So I ask this question: what do we mean when we describe something as political or ascribe it to being politics or political in nature? We might think of many different things. As we come together, we think about that. How we use that phrase to describe things. We might think of political candidates, people who are running for office, platforms of policy making. We might think of bureaucrats and administration. It's kind of a spectrum of these things. And when we think about those, right? Well, all of those are kind of in the same sphere, under the same umbrella of what we mean, right? We might mean administration of public programs, a public service, elected officials, or government. But when we say that, right, we need to also ask what defines the nature of an act, a group, or a set of beliefs as political. We should also ask, are politics inherently biased? Does politics relate to sovereignty and or power, right? Because we describe governing entities, let's say, as being political. Now, the etymology of the term politics, right, we'll kind of go back in time at this. It kind of arose to use in the 1520s from a combination of Old French and medieval Latin, which referenced what out of the Enlightenment period was kind of known as the science of government. That's kind of what they meant when they said something was political. So the inner workings of how we do government. And this is likely actually modeled off of the Greek idea from Aristotle, his idea of ta politika, or the affairs of state. And the Greek roots of that word then, polis, meaning the city or the state or community, and politikos, of citizens related to public life, to form this word ta politika. This idea then that politics has to do with the governing of public life or the administration of government. And that's really important when we start talking about concepts that are kind of at the root of governing authority, like sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is not it's a very old concept, but the way that we actually talk about it in the modern world is actually maybe much more recent than we might realize. The idea of sovereignty that is used by every single country around the world to this day is known as the Westphalian model of sovereignty. If you didn't know that, now you do, right? That there is actually a unified model of sovereignty internationally that nation states subscribe to, and it is this Westphalian model. Now, the Westphalian model, here's the history bit in this is fun, comes from what's known as the Peace of Westphalia, which occurred between 1644 and 1648. During this was kind of the conclusion of the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War between European nations on the continent of Europe, because at a certain point they had so many wars with each other that they kind of stopped naming them and just started naming them after how long they were. That is one of the jokes too, but also for real. At the end of this, several treaties were signed between these nations that kind of became recognized as the foundation to what we now call international law or international diplomacy. The European rulers there, the princes of these nations, are who got together, who signed these peace treaties to end these wars. But part of what they were doing there were instilling principles, and this is what's drawn upon by modern scholars to say this is the idea of how nation states now interact with each other. So it's generally considered an important benchmark in the development of international law and relations between countries. So specifically what resulted from these treaties is down on here on this list. First among them was that these treaties were to establish perpetual peace among the signatories. As one might imagine, perpetual peace did not last during this period, but it was a nice goal to aim for. But the other pieces were an obligation to defend peace, quote, without distinction of religion. This is a really key part, right? Because we're talking the 17th century here. We're talking the Enlightenment period, the period of the rise of secularism, this period where these still ostensibly Christian nations are now coming together and saying, we might need to set aside these religious motives in order to build relationships with each other. These treaties then had stipulations that there's a mistake, spelling mistake there. So normally I tell my students, if you catch a spelling mistake before I do, I owe you $1. I will honor that here, although I have no dollars, so I'm going to try to be quicker than you. So these treaty stipulations were considered permanent binding law between the signatories. And they were considered so important that nations even incorporated them into their own constitutions, such as the Holy Roman Empire. They actually incorporated these treaties into their own constitution, which was a conglomeration of different vassal states that were in kind of Central and Western Europe that worked as a single entity known as the Holy Roman Empire. And now the biggest piece here, though, is that from these treaties, the Catholic and Protestant religions were recognized as equal to each other, and royalty, the princes of these nations, were allowed to choose the religion for their territories. Certain rights then for practicing Christians of other faiths were embedded in their protections, their constitutions to protect these people, and religious immigration was permitted between these nations. Now, this is a huge piece to talk about here because, again, the religious differences were what caused a lot of wars between these European nations. And now we're at this point here where they say, actually, that probably should not be a motivation for going to war with each other anymore. We can set that aside and we can start recognizing that each of these nations has a right to formulate their own laws, to formulate their own ideas, and have that be respected by the others. Very key to this idea of sovereignty then. And finally, too, this also came with a recognition of the independence of Holy Roman Empire imperial estates. Just kind of a fun fact to put in there, but again, kind of the imbuing of these rights then to being recognized for governing authorities. So this is the beginning of international diplomacy, of international law, and this really unified idea of what we mean when we say sovereignty on the international scale. Now, sovereignty, then, we need to describe it a little bit more in how we use it in a contemporary modern context. Pulling out some various definitions here of sovereignty, we can start to build out what this model looks like. What are the aspects, the elements of this model? Oxford Reference Dictionary says that sovereignty is supreme authority in a state. In any state, sovereignty is vested in the institution, person, or body having the ultimate authority to impose law on everyone else in the state. So that's what Oxford Dictionary says, right? And notice the terminology that's used here in these definitions. Supreme, authority, ultimate authority, impose law. Black's Law Dictionary, which is the premier legal dictionary used by attorneys, judges, anybody in the legal field, says that sovereignty is the possession of sovereign power, supreme political authority, paramount control of the Constitution and frame of government and its administration. Paramount control. Max Weber was a 19th century German sociologist who had a major influence on the development of public administration as an area of study. He said that the state is the form of human community that successfully lays claim to the monopoly on legitimate physical violence. That's how he was defining this idea of sovereignty that's vested in states, nation states, countries. And then David Wilkins, Indian scholar from the Lumbee tribe, who's written a lot on American Indian politics, he briefly defined it as a sovereign nation is a distinct political entity that exercises a measure of jurisdictional power over a specific territory. So we can, from these definitions, we can pull out, we can describe what the Westphalian model is, and that's what the model over here on the right-hand side of the slide shows, is that essentially the Westphalian model of sovereignty is that each state has exclusive sovereignty over its territory. Whether we're talking about that in the form of power, the power to exercise sovereignty, we're talking about that with territoriality, the idea that they have a place to exercise that over, legitimacy, that power is exercised in however they declare it to be legitimate, supremacy, that there's nothing else above it, exclusivity, that they exclusively willed it and delegate it, and absolution, that it is the end-all be-all of being able to express power. When people talk about sovereignty, this is what's being talked about. When countries, the leaders of countries talk about sovereignty, whether we're talking about the United States, Canada, China, Zimbabwe, Kazakhstan, wherever, this is what they mean when they talk about sovereignty. Now, when we look at it in history, how this has developed, we also can kind of pair it with the ideas that had kind of emerged from colonization around the same period, during the Enlightenment, during the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And in particular, how European nations were manifesting these ideas of sovereignty, we can describe it this way. Sovereignty requires authority. In other words, it is the right to command and the right to be obeyed. This idea that there is a political superior who issues commands to political inferiors and they have to listen to it. It is expressed over peoples specifically. It's kind of an external thing. It's projected onto others. Sovereignty is legitimized through various ways, and in the Western way, it's usually through legal documents such as constitutions, treaties, or laws. In the past, it was divinity, whether, sovereignty is the idea that it's vested in the state, and the state is vested in a sovereign ruler, like a monarch, for example. And it's also legitimized by what is considered the source of law, which we'll talk about some legal theories a little bit later. And finally, the legitimate sovereign then expresses power through having a monopoly on violence. They're the ones who are allowed to enact violence legally. They authorize the delegation of its power to others. So here, of course, Congress can delegate powers to other areas of the federal government. Authority is exercised within a defined space. There's a territory with boundaries that they declare that they have sovereignty over, and it's an external influence. It's done from the holder of that sovereignty unto others within that realm. When we talk about tribal sovereignty, and we're kind of going to get into this now, how this differs with tribal nations do operate in a similar way in that when the United States talks about sovereignty with tribes, they mean the Westphalian model to a limited degree. When we look at tribal sovereignty and how tribal nations operate, we can kind of break down their sovereignty into three distinct areas. There's the political sovereignty, which is akin to this Westphalian model of sovereignty. And we talk about political sovereignty when we recognize things like nationhood, geopolitical boundaries, military dominance, and forms of government. But there's also this aspect of cultural sovereignty here, where tribal nations manifest distinct identities. They hold particular spiritual beliefs. They practice certain customs and traditions, and they have a persistent language that is identified with their culture. But then also finally is kind of this unique category that gets into also the legal aspect of this, and that is what we call inherent sovereignty. This is a phrase that is used only in reference to tribal nations. It is considered generational in that the sovereign power, the ability to act sovereign, passes from one generation to another, and tribes are considered self-governing. They have the ability to exercise powers of governance within their own sphere of influence. So these are kind of the three dynamics that come together to define tribal sovereignty and where it kind of differs from this idea of Westphalian sovereignty. Now, putting that all together, right, when we talk about tribal nations, as governments, we truly mean that that is what they are. This quote here also coming from Wilkins and Stark saying, most important, any discussion of American government must be based on the fact that Native peoples inhabited this hemisphere before the European invasion. Originally, North Americans dealt with indigenous peoples as sovereign nations by signing formal treaties with them. And we're going to dive really into that treaty aspect too here in a moment. This other quote here is really poignant as well. It says, regardless of the form of government, it is important to note that the leadership of every tribal nation across time has sought to provide for the community's defense and safety, has allocated resources according to tradition and custom, has overseen domestic and foreign relations, and has, in general, provided for the basic needs and desires of their people. The things a government does. Tribes have done this since time immemorial, since before the United States was a nation, and they continue to do this to this day, not just for their own members, their own citizens, but a lot of times they are also performing these services for non-Indigenous peoples as well. And this is the case too when we talk about any group of Indigenous peoples historically or contemporarily, whether that's the Mississippian cultures located in the Midwest, the city-states of Mesoamerica like the Maya or the Aztec, the Hopewell culture, which spanned all the way from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or you might recognize as the Iroquois Confederacy, the Powhatan Confederacy, the Confederacy of 30 tribes that the Jamestown colonists interacted with, or any and all indigenous nations. They function as governments. Now, tribal sovereignty in this regard then looks a little bit different in how it manifests compared to this Westphalian model. Tribes have their own idea and understanding of what it means to be sovereign. And when we look at these kind of characteristics then, pulling them together based off this political, cultural, and inherent sovereign aspects, this is kind of how we can describe tribal sovereignty. Sovereignty is vested within the peoples, so it's a form of popular sovereignty, which there is a form of that in the United States as well. But particularly with tribal nations, all authority is coming from within the community. This means that the community or the collective of people hold the final authority on what expression of power looks like. And authority is delegated from the ground up. So for example, traditionally among my people, the Nez Perce, who inhabited where Washington, Idaho, and Oregon meet nowadays, our traditional lands span all 3 states. Traditionally, our peoples were divided into separate bands that roamed particular areas on our traditional lands, and each band had kind of a head person to it. Now, sometimes this head person, that role was passed down in a hereditary fashion from father to son. But if the community lost faith in that head person, they could actually be ejected regardless of the hereditary aspect. And a new person from our class structure could be appointed to be a leader. So that's kind of what we mean by sovereignty from the ground up. Sovereignty also revolves around cultural identity. And this goes to that cultural sovereignty aspects. That cultural integrity is maintained through the practicing and developing of traditions, that laws are considered natural, that laws are embedded in the universe, there is morality in the universe. Law does not strictly come from people, from one person to another who writes laws. And that the community practices discipline and self-commitment, that there's a self-adherence to this law. And finally, that kind of wraps into this final point that sovereignty becomes both an external and internal expression. Whereas in the Westphalian model, sovereignty is expressed over peoples, tribal sovereignty focuses on having people internalize sovereignty and becoming practicing members of their laws and customs and traditions because they're self-motivated to do so. The individuals concede part of their will to the collective, but the collective also respects the free will and agency of individuals because they make up the collective. It's kind of a reciprocal nature. Now, historically, kind of bringing this back, right, when we start talking about especially how this indigenous perspective, this tribal perspective mixes in with the European perspective that we have here, it's important that we set a couple ground rules. First and foremost is that the sovereignty of indigenous peoples in the Americas is verified by these 2 important facts. The first is that Native nations and tribal forms of government existed before European colonization. And this was by admission of the Europeans, by admission of them. There was no doubt that tribes existed before they arrived here. And the second is that Europeans recognized political sovereignty of tribes, and this was done through the formation of legal and political documents such as treaties. They recognized it. European recognition does not grant sovereignty to tribal nations. It merely recognized its historical existence. European nations chose to interact with tribes in ways that they would have interacted with any other nations as a pragmatic means to an end. And the United States carried over that very same practice. So if there's one thing you walk away from this talk with tonight, it is that piece, that the United States, that European nations did not give tribes or indigenous peoples sovereignty. They did not grant them power or authority. Tribes retained that as an inherent aspect to who they are, like any other nation around the world. They did not give us anything. That's what I always really stress with my students too. They ain't give. Don't you strike the word give from your vocabulary. So European forms of sovereignty then legitimized indigenous nations, not in general, but into European and later American frameworks of law and politics. The United States looked at tribal nations and said, we need to find a way to work with these tribes for one reason or another, and we will do that through making treaties with them, which recognizes that sovereignty of tribes. And we have a really, really good historical example of this actually happening, going all the way back to the Jamestown colony. So, of course, during this time, Jamestown, private venture that was launched, these colonists arrive here and they encounter the Powhatan Confederacy. And in doing so, the Jamestown colonists realized that they were at a disadvantage. They were outnumbered. The Powhatan Confederacy was 30 plus tribal nations, just down here, kind of in the bottom part of this map that we see over here. But this map here also shows you kind of the grander scale, just out throughout this area around the Great Lakes, the New England area, the Old Northwest. Just see how many tribal nations there were at this point, right? Any of the early English colonists would have been surrounded. So they chose to go about diplomacy. Not warfare, not extortion. They chose diplomacy. And we have this particular account coming from the Jamestown colony. So the English were setting up settlements between 1604 and 1664, but it occurred within the context of this indigenous supremacy, let's call it. Captain Gabriel Archer was the recorder for the Jamestown colony. He was responsible for writing the documents and keeping the history of the colony. And he recorded the engagements that Jamestown actually had with tribal nations in this time period. His reports indicate a great contrast between European and indigenous forms of sovereignty. And specifically, Glover here in this reference, a book called Paper Sovereigns, he talks about what Gabriel Archer wrote in these reports, and he describes the reports as this, saying, in a startling departure from European conventions, Archer offered an account of treaty making on Indian terms, pointing to the exchange of shouts and other indigenous rituals as proof of friendship. Early Anglo-Native treaty documents were rhetorical documents crafted to meet the needs of particular constituencies. In other words, the first treaties between European nations and tribal nations, they were tribal treaties. They were done in indigenous forms of communication. They were not written documents like the ones that we think about today in this kind of dominant form of international law we see of written documents in the Western world. So the early period here that started establishing this whole idea of relations between tribal nations and European and later the United States as nations was done on tribal terms. Very key to recognize here. So with that kind of foregrounding out of the way, we can now kind of dive into where this starts bleeding into our modern day understanding of tribal sovereignty and tribal nations. And we can start that by talking about the doctrine of discovery and this formal treaty making we've been pointing to. So, doctrine of discovery, very confusing thing. If you're not familiar with it, I'm about to blow your mind on it. You're going to be like, what? Is that really the case? If you're not sure, I promise you, it happens with students all the time too. The idea of the doctrine of discovery, it is both a legal and religious doctrine or a principle that is held and subscribed to, and particularly in law as well. It is predicated on the concept of papal supremacy, which is another Catholic doctrine that recognizes the Pope's authority as the ultimate authority over things like the temporal state, so the physical realm, ecclesiastical privileges, affairs of the church, actions of monarchs, and apostolic succession, who becomes the next pope. There was a decline in papal supremacy during the period we're kind of talking about around the Peace of Westphalia, so around 16th, 17th century. But in the early period of colonization, when we're talking about the 1400s, this was actually still a very strong, dominant doctrine that guided the actions of colonizing European nations. And the Pope had a lot of say. The papacy had a lot of say in how these nations were going to interact with each other when it came to claiming overseas possessions. The doctrine of discovery originated then in the 1400s with the issuance of several papal bulls. Papal bulls, these are like official proclamations of the Catholic Church issued by the Pope. They formed what we know as canon law or religious law of the Catholic Church. There's many bulls, but the ones in particular that form what we understand as the doctrine of discovery, because it's not one unified doctrine, it's actually comprised, a composite doctrine of these multiple bulls. The first one was issued in 1452, known as Dum Diversus, and this bull established the idea that Portugal, King Alfonso of Portugal, was allowed to reduce pagans, people considered non-Christians, and specifically at this time, speaking of Muslims, the caliphates that were kind of entering the Iberian Peninsula, reduce them to perpetual slavery. Was this idea that if Portugal takes overseas territories, they can reduce the non-Christians, the pagans there, into slavery. The next one comes from 2 years later, Romanus Pontifex. There's several bulls that are named this that kind of dealt with colonization, but this one in particular is the one we're looking at. From 1454, it was an expansion of Dum Diversus where it worked to protect the claims of European nations. The Pope said that European nations who discover other areas, other lands, discover them, they have to respect the discoveries of other Christian European nations. And it kind of reinforced the Pope's authority to make these decisions. The final one here is known as Inter Caetera, and this one was in 1493, so 40 years later. And this is really important because there was a new pope by this time. The pope during this period of 1493 was from Castile, what would become the Kingdom of Spain. Castile was a rival of Portugal, whom many of these previous bulls benefited. So Castile goes to the Pope and says, hey, since you were, kind of like one of our citizens, could you do us a favor, maybe a quid pro quo kind of deal? And the Pope accepts that. In this one, the Pope assigned the right to conquer land in the New World to Castile, right? Because this is just shortly after Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right, in 1492, and supposedly stumbled across the New World. And in this case, then, the Pope assigned a lot of these areas then to be colonized to Castile. But in this same bull issued or commanded that all monarchs had to respect the realm of other Christian monarchs. Now, we're here in the United States. There were parts of it that were colonized by Spain in the possession of Spain for a short time, but by and large, the primary colonizing nation of what is now the United States was Britain. And by that period, by the Jamestown colony period, was Britain Catholic? I'm testing y'all's history. No, they were not, right? There was the split from the Catholic Church. So Britain wasn't Catholic. How did they use the doctrine of discovery then to make claims? Because they did. They actually went back further, and they based it on two concepts known as Roman law and natural law. I know this is a lot of text, I'm sorry. Like I said, complex topic. So right here, this side kind of explains in detail what each of these bulls did, but we're going to kind of focus over here on the right side of this slide. I'm going to use this, not that button. Let's see if this one will work. The light button keeps moving the slide. I don't know how that works. That's okay. That's all right. Just look at the right side of the slide. We're going to talk about these legal and associated concepts that Britain was pulling on here. Because Britain was no longer Catholic, they did not have the ability to claim these bulls as the authority, the source of their authority to stake their claims in the New World. What they did, though, was they appealed specifically to the source or the basis of papal supremacy, of papal canon law, which was Roman law, right? The papacy was, of course, headed in Rome, which was the former seat of the Roman Empire, and all European nations at that time, their roots of their legal systems traced back to the Romans in some form or fashion, particularly around real estate law. And so the British made claims to Roman law and proceeded to enact their foreign policy with tribal nations in the same fashion that Rome did. When Rome went colonizing other areas, Rome actually made treaties. They used treaties as an instrument to engage in diplomacy with areas that they colonized. England proceeded to do the same thing. But they also pulled some other ideas in order to justify their claims. So the first one there is right of conquest, which was a justification for war. The only thing you really need to know about this is that refusing to trade with a nation was considered justification for war at this time. Spain often used that to actually engage in war with tribal nations, saying they don't want to trade with us. They're infringing on our international right to have trade with them. How dare they? We know they don't speak Spanish, but we're going to do it anyways. The second one is kind of where we get the idea from the Roman law, is the law of nations, or jus gentium. This was taken from a perspective known as natural law, which is an early legal theory that the Romans used. This goes back to, you can see Cicero, who commented on this idea. It was the notion that all peoples, regardless if you believe you're superior to them or they're inferior to you, right? Regardless of that, it was this belief that all peoples naturally had rights unto themselves. Natural law. And that was given through a higher power of sorts, whether that was the divine, whether that was because of human reasoning and rationality, because it was nature, whatever it was. The Romans used that as kind of a legal theory for them. The early naturalist position then, which this idea of natural law survived into the Enlightenment period, was the idea that the rational and natural customs that were held by all people, regardless of statehood, regardless of having a centralized governing body, was what allowed them to be recognized as nations. The later naturalist viewpoint, which is kind of what Britain would later adopt and the United States would later adopt, was that there was actually a division of individual and state. That the state, the centralized governing authority, is what actually held rights as a nation, not individual peoples or groups of peoples who did not have a state. So if you were stateless, you weren't actually considered to have rights then under this natural law idea. So Roman law, right, as the basis for this canon law and other early European legal systems, offered the legitimacy for treaties that were used by England. They used these other Latin terms, these ideas, consensus ad idem, meaning that they established a consensus with the people they entered into treaties with. Consensus. Britain said, we made a treaty with these early tribes, these tribal nations, and therefore we recognize their sovereignty, but they recognize our sovereignty. They considered it a reciprocal thing. Animus, the idea of plans to settle, and corpus, the idea of physical possession, that European nations could lay animus to lands that they did not have corpus or physical possession of. And res nullis, or nobody's thing, that if you're not recognized as a legitimate nation state, it's nobody's thing. It's there to be discovered. And finally, also terra nullis, empty land, and terra incognita, the idea of unknown land, that lands that had not been discovered by other colonizing nations, therefore were up for grabs, for claim. This is the legal foundation of colonization in the Americas and what would ultimately become the doctrine of discovery in U.S. law. The treaties were a big part in facilitating this, as we said. It was an instrument to procure land from tribal nations. So the early colonial treaties in North America, which kind of span from the 1500s to the 1780s, these were established by European and mainly British peoples, and they meant to establish their own claims to the land as well, to the territory that created legitimate claims outside of conquest. This was how to do it through diplomacy. They also use these treaties to develop a narrative of subordination of indigenous nations, saying, we, of course, as Britain, as a European nation, are superior to these tribal nations, and because they made a treaty with us, they are recognizing our superiority. This was the narrative they were crafting. And then finally, this entering into formal relations with indigenous nations also came with, again, the recognizing of tribal sovereignty of them as nations. Because you don't make treaties with country clubs. You don't make treaties with individuals. You make treaties with other nations. It is purely a tool for international diplomacy. Later on, there was then treaties with the United States. And these early treaty periods, there were treaties made after the 1820s, but this particular area between the 1780s and 1820s, this continued that same treaty-making tradition that Britain had established. It secured the new borders of the United States after the Revolution, and they were used to maintain relationships with tribes, particularly the tribes that were still allied with European nations. It legitimized the sovereignty of the United States in the eyes of European nations abroad, showing that they could enter into friendly relations with the nations that were on the borders of the United States. And the United States used them to obtain land cessions through the sale and the extinguishing of tribal land claims. We'll talk about that a bit more too in a couple slides. But important to note, right, again, this was an entering into formal relations with indigenous nations, and it acknowledged the tribe's retained geopolitical power. But I want to highlight this map here real quick because it looks a little interesting, right? We might recognize it as the East Coast of the United States, and we might recognize Virginia and North and South Carolina and Georgia, but they look a little bit bigger than they do nowadays, right? This map was made in 1755, and it was the idea that it was showing the colonies' land claims under Britain, under the British throne. The idea that they extended in perpetuity. Even though they had these treaties with tribes, this was the European understanding of their land claims, that they had an overriding claim to the land, even if they did not have corpus, physical possession. They had animus, the claim to the land. And that extended all the way till wherever it ended. Okay, now here's the real crazy part, all right? The doctrine of discovery in U.S. law. The U.S. made claims to the lands in North America, and they are defined as an inheritance from Britain. This is partially established by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonists from settling Indian lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, and identified this as the Indian territory where tribes possessed what is known as Aboriginal title or Indian title. And the reason that King George III, the same one from the Revolutionary War, issued this proclamation was because tribes had sided with Britain in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and so this was done in an attempt to stop colonists from settling more lands. Britain did not want to do it because they wanted to respect the claims of tribes at this point. And with the waning British authority and geopolitical force in the New World, it wasn't advantageous for Britain to continue on in prolonged wars with tribal nations. However, after the Revolutionary War, the Royal Proclamation becomes an issue for the United States because of settlers who wanted to buy land now on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. And the first time we hear about this issue comes up in 1810 in a case known as Fletcher v. Peck. And in this, Chief Justice John Marshall, the longest reigning Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and one of the most pivotal characters in all of U.S. law, who really kind of defined the power of the Supreme Court even to this day, said in this, right, he identified that Indian title continues to exist, this Aboriginal title, as seen in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, but he said that it exists as, quote, mere occupancy rights, and not true and legal possession that can only be extinguished. This comes up again in 1823 in a case known as Johnson v. McIntosh. This claim, or this case again, with the opinion issued by Chief Justice John Marshall, articulated the rights of colonizing European nations. It founded on the doctrine of discovery, and conveyed the same rights to the United States as the inheritor of European claims. Therefore, tribal nations did not hold property rights and thus could only sell lands to the quote-unquote discovering nation. First Britain, then the United States as the successor after the Revolutionary War. This understanding, this precedent, was upheld as recently as 2005 in a opinion issued by by Justice Ruth Gator Ginsburg in the case of City of Sherrill v. Oneida Indian Nation of New York, where it was said that tribes cannot reassert sovereignty over previously held lands even if they fairly purchase them as fee title, they own it privately, because that fee title is held by the discovering European nation and later the original states in the United States. Right? That is precedent to this day. What started as a religious Catholic doctrine of religious law made its way into U.S. law and is upheld to this day that tribal nations, Indian people, cannot legally hold full and true and legal possession of their lands. That's crazy. And so, again, this goes back to the Marshall trilogy of Supreme Court cases. Chief Justice John Marshall laid out a lot of the principles that define federal Indian law as we know it to this day. So Johnson v. McIntosh was that first case, but we have two subsequent cases, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia and Worcester v. Georgia. The ideas in this, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, was the idea that tribes are what the United States considered domestic dependent nations. They're not foreign nations under the Constitution. He created this new term to say that tribes are dependent on the United States in certain ways. And Worcester v. Georgia was Marshall's attempt to actually roll back both of these cases. He tried to roll back the idea that tribes don't actually own their land because he started to feel sorry for them, quite literally. And he then declared that tribes were distinct political communities who retain their original rights. That seems a little contradictory, right? That is the theme in federal Indian law. So he tried to roll back a lot of the stuff in this case, but he died shortly after. Andrew Jackson packed the Supreme Court, and 5 subsequent cases overruled Marshall's overruling in Worcester v. Georgia. And this kind of wraps into the idea of manifest destiny and American westward expansion. The United States, of course, was rapidly expanding. And after the War of 1812, the United States was able to shut out other European influence from North America, kind of from the Western Hemisphere, and shut off tribes from having the ability to garner more European allies. And so because of that, you saw the U.S. then expanding into the old Northwest Territory in 1783. You saw the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. You saw the annexation of Spanish Florida in 1819. And then further, right, you saw the annexation of Texas in 1845, the incorporation of Oregon and California in 1846 and 47, the cession of the Mexican territories to the Southwest in 1848. All of that was happening is shown on this map here, right? The United States is making treaties and it's making land deals to purchase all of these lands and consolidate all of these land holdings. But notice what's missing from this map. Does anybody know? I'll give you a hint. It's the tribes. Yeah, the tribes. There you go. Yeah. The tribes are missing from this map. So what's happening with all the treaties that are being made with tribes? This is to establish these discovery land claims. This map shows what's happening with the Indian treaties. All of these, here we got California, Idaho, Oklahoma, Washington, just as a few examples. All of the treaties, nearly 400 treaties signed with tribal nations used to extinguish the claims of tribes through this method, through purchasing their lands, rather than all-out war, although the United States also still annexed things through all-out war. So these treaties then represent a duality, and this bleeds into the tribal sovereignty aspect as well. It leads to a duality of how tribes exist, that these treaties recognized tribal sovereignty while at the same time dispossessing tribes of land. And that's a very key aspect here to understand that these treaties function on both of these ends. So we're kind of going to go through this part a little bit quickly, but we're going to talk about the Constitution now and kind of just really focus in on the principles that we can get from federal Indian law based off all this context and history we've just covered. So Indians and tribal nations are mentioned 3 times, 2 times explicitly, and there's an implicit mention sort of that's in the Constitution. The first mention comes from Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 that says, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, excluding Indians not taxed. Now, forewarning, Indians pay taxes. I get that question a lot. Do Indians really pay taxes? Yes, Indians pay taxes. This was in relation to the early period when Indians were not considered U.S. citizens or citizens of the states which they might have been within the borders of. It is no longer really applicable or relevant to modern federal Indian law. The other one, though, the other explicit mention, which is the basically foundation of all federal Indian law, is Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 3, that says, the Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is the major clause used to deal with Indians in most cases. It shows that relations between tribes in the United States are external matters for both states and the federal government, meaning that tribes exist outside the Constitution. They are extra-constitutional, and that tribes are pre-existing sovereigns whose existence is not beholden to the federal or the state governments. There's also the clause about treaty making, which says the president shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties. And this identifies which federal officials are responsible for creating treaties, but it had that implied power early on that the president could negotiate treaties with tribal nations. That's what happened. And this diagram here kind of just shows conceptually all of what we've been talking about so far. Here on the left side of this slide shows the framework of the United States government with our federalist system and the state governments, and the right side kind of shows the analogous version for the setup of tribal governments, where here in the United States, sovereignty is a popular sovereignty vested with the people, who gives authority to the Constitution, that then is delegating authority to the federal government, which then delegates authority to the state governments, et cetera, versus the idea with tribal nations that sovereignty comes from this inherent aboriginal sovereignty that exists before the United States. And then that goes to tribal constitutions, which then go to tribal governments and tribal codes and laws, et cetera. Now, how this works in terms of federalism is really complex. So the three branches of government, though, have different areas where they touch on this. The biggest thing to know is that the executive and judicial branches actually have no formal responsibility per the Constitution to deal with tribal nations. It is the legislative branch, or Congress, that does, because the Constitution says Congress will have the power to regulate commerce with the Indian nations. Anything else that the executive or judicial branches handle, the executive handles as a matter of Congress delegating that to them, and the judicial branch cleans up the mess, basically, between the other two, because they're not actually meant to deal with Indian issues. So Congress is the seat, though, of where the power over federal Indian law comes from. Now, some legal concepts, kind of the principles. We're kind of winding down here, but we can pull out some final ideas and thoughts that we can talk about. There's this idea in federal Indian law known as the canons of Indian treaty construction, which is based off one of those Marshall trilogy of Supreme Court cases, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia from 1832. And it is this idea that tribes were disadvantaged in the treaty making with the United States for a number of reasons. And so courts have developed kind of these four principles of how to interpret treaties even in a modern context. The first is that treaty language must be construed as the Indians would have understood it at the time of signing the treaty. The second is that the rights reserved by tribes in treaties remain intact unless Congress has expressed clear and unambiguous contrary intent. Indian treaties must be construed liberally in favor of the Indians, and ambiguities in the treaty language must be resolved in favor of the Indians. And this comes from an idea that's based out of a court case from 1905, United States v. Winans, among others, but this is a very prominent one, where the Supreme Court, and this is actually originating from Washington State, between the state and Yakama Nation. The court said, the right of taking fish, which was kind of at the center of this issue and which also related to the later Bolt decision in the 70s, was not a grant of right to the Indians, but a reservation by the Indians of rights already possessed and not granted away by them. The rights so reserved imposed a servitude on the entire land relinquished to the United States under the treaty. So this idea that these treaties recognize the existing rights of tribes, and this is what we call the reserved rights doctrine, that any right that a sovereign nation would normally possess that is not expressly extinguished by a treaty is presumptively reserved by the tribe. So tribes retain these rights. Treaties don't grant them. Treaties may recognize. Treaties may extinguish, but they do not grant these rights. Tribes retain them unto themselves. This concept of tribal sovereignty is kind of what we're getting to the root of, and it's this idea, right, as we said, that tribes possess inherent sovereignty, which was first articulated in U.S. law by Chief Justice John Marshall in Worcester v. Georgia, 1832. That Marshall trilogy of Supreme Court cases, you always got to go back to them, basically, in this area of study. The Supreme Court has found that tribal governments are unique aggregations possessing attributes of sovereignty over both their members and their territory, also said in United States v. Wheeler, 1978, and that tribes are able to exercise a wide variety of sovereign powers, and we see these manifest differently throughout the country. But generally, these powers are the power to establish a form of government, could be a theocracy even in the case of like the Pueblo nations. The power to determine membership or citizenship, whether that's a thing like blood quantum, your ancestry, or lineage, if you trace your ancestors back to a certain role, or if they just wanted to declare everybody in this room a tribal citizen today if they wanted to. They could. The power to administer justice and set up their own courts, the power to exclude persons from the reservation, trespass law or trespass power, the power to charter business organizations, which the Department of Treasury just issued very recently that, yes, that is not taxable income by tribal chartered businesses, the power to police and sovereign immunity, that you can't just sue a tribe because you want to. They gotta let you. And these all are kind of articulated. I'll just kind of go through these, kind of what we've been getting at here, that tribes, again, are framed under this idea of domestic dependent nations, that it is based on this ruling in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia that assumes that tribes are not capable of caring for themselves to the fullest degree, so the United States has to help a little bit. Government-to-government relationship, which is maintained first and foremost with the federal government, not the state governments. That there is a trust responsibility where the United States owes an obligation to tribes on the basis of these treaties, and that Congress has plenary power or this right to regulate the relationship with tribes. And I think this is my last slide, that the trust responsibility being rooted in these treaties is very key here. This idea of the trust responsibility and obligation that the United States has to tribal nations. The Supreme Court reaffirmed this as recent as 2011, where they said that there exists a general trust relationship between the United States and the Indian people, and that the federal government has charged itself with moral obligations of the highest responsibility and trust, to the fulfillment of which the national honor has been committed. Lofty words. And it is true that every single treaty has been violated between the tribes and the United States, usually by the United States. But this principle, this idea, is still something to uphold. The national honor depends on it. And what this does is that means it implicates this trust responsibility and this duty of upholding treaties, not just to tribes, but to every single American citizen who is represented by the federal government as a party, as a signatory to this treaty, to any of the treaties with tribal nations. This relationship is rooted in those signed treaties that typically provided some of the following things: reserved parcels of land, such as reservations, the protection of the tribes by the United States, and program services and supplies like food, clothing, annuities, education, trade, and health services that were promised in exchange for the very lands that our houses now sit on. Some examples of these come from the Cherokee Treaty of Hopewell, 1785, which guaranteed peace to all the Cherokee and the protection of the United States of America. The treaty with the Dene, or the Navajo Nation, 1849, guaranteed the tribe would be placed under the exclusive jurisdiction and protection of the government, who would ensure the permanent prosperity and happiness of said Indians. That one they kind of fell short of. And the treaty with the Yankton Sioux, 1858, guarantee from the federal government to protect the said tribe in the quiet and peaceful possession of its remaining land. Some of it's a little, in hindsight, we kind of laugh at it now, but we can hold them, we can take them to court over this, is my point. And finally, here are the references for what was spoken about. Thank you so much. You've been a lovely audience. That's what I've got for you. 2 minutes over, I apologize. But questions, yes, questions.
Yes. Oh, right here.
I'm just curious if you can explain the difference between reservation land and tribal trust.
Yes, okay, great. I've got a whole nother lecture. So tribal land holdings, there are a variety of them. Reservations are what are considered reserved parcels of land for the exclusive use and occupancy of tribal nations. Before, let's just say 1900, most tribal land was held through what we call that Indian title, the occupancy rights. However, those occupancy rights can be, and for the most part, have been extinguished throughout the country. And instead, now tribes hold on to their land through what is known as trust land. This is where they have title to the land, the tribe does, and they turn it over to the federal government to hold on behalf of the tribe. Now, that sounds real suspicious, and it is, because it goes back to the idea that tribal nations cannot actually fully own their land if they want to exercise sovereignty over it. They have to put the land into trust where the feds hold the title to it, and then tribes can exercise sovereign powers over that land, basically under the jurisdiction of the United States to a limited degree. There are aspects actually of the Constitution and federal law that do not apply to tribes or on reservation, and they had to fix that with pieces of legislation throughout the 20th century. But by and large, when we say trust land, we usually mean land that does belong to a tribe in that they have occupancy rights for it, but that the title is held by the federal government and it is thus removed from the jurisdiction of the states and local governments as well. Makes it non-taxable, and again, gives tribes a land base from which they can exercise the Westphalian model of sovereignty.
We have an online question. Somebody was asking actually a very similar question that I think you already answered, but the second part to that question is, I have heard that houses on reservation land are not on privately owned land that can be sold along with the building. Is this accurate?
It can be accurate. Yeah, it's a very complex area, but yes, by and large, usually what happens in many cases on reservations, the tribe might be the one exercising sovereignty over that land. It could be trust land. It could be fee land held by the tribe. It could be fee land held by the tribe, but it has restrictions placed on it by the federal government, which means it works like trust land, even though it's not technically trust land. And in that case, the tribe or the federal government will lease that land to an individual homeowner, and the homeowner will own the home, but they won't own the land, but they usually get like a 99-year lease that's negotiated as part of them owning that. And then that way the land base remains under the authority of the tribe, and should that lease expire, it doesn't get it's not lost from the tribe, because that's a lot of these measures have been created in order to counteract what's known as the General Allotment Act from 1887, and that's where tribes held their land communally. The United States said that's socialism, so you can't do that. And they took all the land and then broke it into 160-acre parcels and gave it to individual Indian landowners. It would be in trust for a period of 25 years, then it would fall out of trust, then you could sell it, but that was only if the federal government deemed you competent, which was usually based on how Indian you were. Yeah. This is fun. I like Q&A.
Thank you. By the way, well done.
Thank you.
I've got a question here. Given the history of Roman law and natural law, as interpreted by the British and the Americans, what is the most egregious example of the use of all of that history on an indigenous culture? And by the way, could you go back one slide? Because I noticed something in your presentation, bottom. I see the Cherokee Treaty. I see the Trail of Tears. I see the Treaty of the Dene. I see the Long Walk. I see the Treaty of the Yukon Sioux, and I see Wounded Knee. And is this tracking? Do those cases also track with the question I just asked?
Very, very perceptive question. And it would be hard to pinpoint any particular example, but I would say it is the thesis that I try to develop with students when talking about this is that there's a very clear line in the power dynamic when it shifted, that the United States wanted to make treaties with tribes early on because they were weak. And they very much said so. Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War under George Washington, even said that, saying, we can't get into continuous wars with tribes because we can't sustain it. The coffers are dry from the Revolution. There are more of them than we have in a standing army. The Constitution is kind of limiting us at this point. They couldn't do it. And the moment that they could, all of this treaty language that they had kind of went out the door. And that is what I would say is kind of what I would say is very egregious, because we look at a lot of these examples in history where they base these ideas of law, and under this Western idea of sovereignty, it just goes back to who has the bigger stick, who has that monopoly on violence. And that this isn't to absolve tribes. Tribes also went to war with the United States, very much so. And in many times, though, that was often the result of these circumstances, though, that were being crafted by a power that was growing to be more and more dominant, that wanted to have justification because its legal system demanded so, but that they never had any intention of living up to. And that is the difficult thing. Not just for tribes to go into court and discuss and to litigate, but to talk about it. When I talk about it with students, they always get to this point of like, why are the treaties broken? Why do they do this? These are very clear terms. Why is that? And it's the only answer I can give them is actually the answer from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that issued this ruling. I think it was 2005. They said that federal Indian law is best explained not by logic, but by history. And that's all I can tell them. Yeah.
Somebody online is asking, is income from Indian casinos taxed?
So, yes and no. The revenue generated by Indian casinos is not taxable as a tribal establishment. However, if you are employed by a tribal casino, then the income you draw, your paycheck that you draw from that is taxable. This is highly regulated by the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act and a couple other laws, but those laws are trying to also funnel tribal revenue from primarily gaming establishments into certain ways. So federal law requires that tribes also use that money for charitable funds, that it can't be used as profit, essentially, that it has to be used to fund government services, which are principles I agree with. I think those are the best use of that revenue in the first place. But for the tribes themselves that operate those gaming establishments, the revenue is not taxable, since tribes are considered a separate sovereign entity and would not be paying that tax to the feds. Wouldn't be paying that tax to the states and vice versa. So the tribes don't pay that to the feds.
Yeah, could you scroll back to the map that showed all the treaties with the different colors?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite maps.
No, the other one. The one that showed the Northwest in green.
Oh, okay. This one?
Yeah, that's the one. Now, you see Southwest Washington there.
Yes.
From the Columbia River north to Puget Sound and then over to the coast. Is that all one color, or is there two colors to that?
So that is, it's the same color, but identifying two separate land cession areas. These maps were compiled, I got the citation right down here, but these were compiled around the turn of the century in order to actually identify where these land cessions were, because up until this point, the federal government actually kind of lost track of the particular land cessions relevant not just to treaties, but executive orders and other federal legislation that were passed after treaty making was ended with tribes in 1871. And so they're hard to see, but each of them are numbered. So this lower one is 458, the upper one is 347. Those correspond to the cessions identified in the some 400 treaties. And so they're two separate cessions.
Okay, well, about half of that part of Southwest Washington has no treaty. The Showalters and the Chehalis tribe and the Cowlitz Indian tribe, they never signed a treaty.
Correct.
They were, Governor Stevens made 10 treaties, but the treaty conference in the middle, the Chehalis River Treaty, was never signed. And so those tribes were never given any compensation or reservations until much later.
Yes.
So the date of that map is 1899?
Yes.
Okay, well, that answers my question, because my
Very, yeah, not current.
yeah, it was after the United States just took the land from the tribes with no treaty.
Right. And
I call them pre-treaty tribes.
Yes, no, very perceptive, and I'm glad that you brought that up. So there are tribes that have treaties. There are also tribes that don't have treaties, and the examples you brought up there are tribes that don't here in Washington State. A lot of what the treaties identified in maps like this were particular not to the established reservations or even the signatories of them, but more so the distribution of the cession, the pure land cessions that came from it. I have another map that shows the Stevens Treaty areas, and it shows how that part was left out, as you indicated. Part of that cession, though, actually came from the Palmer treaties in Oregon, right before the Washington territory was fully split. And so a lot of the times the Stevens treaties are the Stephen-Palmer treaties, because even though they didn't negotiate with each other, they had overlapping land cessions that they later had to settle with each other between what they were negotiating with the tribes in Oregon versus the ones in Washington.
The Palmer and Dark treaties, some of them were, a lot of the original Oregon treaties were Indian Ancient Dark and Palmer, they were rejected by Congress.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and excuse me. There's a really interesting connection between the Stevens treaties and Midwest treaties. There's another image I have, not on this one, but that shows a linguistic connection that, and you might see it in some of the language of the treaties, like Medicine Creek Treaty here, shows that there's a reference to the treaty with the Omahas from Nebraska. And that's because when Stevens came over here, he was sent a copy of the treaty with the Omahas and also a couple others from treaties made under George Maypenny, who was the superintendent for Indian Affairs of the Midwest, and negotiated the treaties with tribes in Nebraska, but also the ones around the Great Lakes. And in those ones had a specific reference to the right of fishing. And then there's a linguistic connection then in that template that came over here and the persistent protection of the right of fishing for tribes in the Pacific Northwest. So a lot treaties are my particular area of study, and so like it's really fascinating to make all these connections between them.
Also, my understanding is the non-treaty areas, Southwest Washington, was still non-treaty in 1863.
Yes.
And in 1863, you might remember, President
Yep.
So he opened all that land by executive order. We've heard a lot about executive orders lately.
Yeah, we sure have.
That's what Abraham Lincoln did, and that's how the settlers allotted all those lands into
Yep.
I'm a lot of myself.
Oh, okay. We should get together and talk.
Basically, Lincoln was in trouble, so he freed the slaves and didn't take the slave owners.
So I think that folks online cannot hear him, so.
Right. Yeah, for our folks on Zoom, just a conversation about the contextual history that was happening here, especially in the 1860s with the Civil War and Lincoln opening up land for settlement in order to fill the coffers as the war effort wasn't going in the way of the Union. And so that was a big piece also that led into land cessions that were done, or that we see kind of here, and executive orders that were signed to open up land for settlement.
So we're going to take 2 more questions. We have one online and we'll do one more in person.
Okay, online we have, do the tribes practice the idea of private property?
Nowadays, yeah, for sure. So this is another thing that often comes up in this area, the idea of whether tribes recognized or understood the idea of private property. Yes, you can argue conceptually that tribes, of course, understood the idea that land could belong to a particular family or community or another group of people. What was a bit more of a foreign concept is this idea of private property ownership insofar as land can be exclusive and this idea of title can be held and pass on. So like the idea of the occupancy rights is, well, it's even foreign to the idea of Western real estate law, but the idea that a tribe could not actually own land that they reside on, right? Doesn't make a lot of sense, I think, in general, to anybody, native or non-native. But to varying degrees, you can look at examples of tribes that practiced what might be similar to our modern idea of private property. So for example, amongst the Makah who come from Nia Bay, traditionally they're a whale hunting people. They actually identified areas of the ocean near where Nia Bay is out on the peninsula that belonged, so to speak, to families who would hunt those particular areas. And so there was, regulation, so to speak, between the families who would go to those particular areas. For my people, like out on the Columbia River, where we would go there and fish, my people, even though much closer to modern day Idaho, would go all the way down, even to the mouth of the Columbia. We'd go to places like Celilo Falls. They had fishing platforms that extend over the edge of the riparian, looking over the rivers, and those pass from family to family. So there are ideas of, let's say, ownership and limiting or exclusivity to that. But it's a much longer conversation of getting into like the cultural idea of communal land ownership, that land can be also for the entire tribe, that exclusivity might come with the seasons based off what's available. My people were semi-nomadic. We had a traditional area that we were in, but it was very large, and during the seasons we'd go to different spots, and people would know, oh, that's the spot for that family, or that's the spot for this family. But that might also change hands over time as well. So kind of yes, kind of no. The answer is always sometimes, depends, maybe.
I just had a question about with this tribal trust land, with the land back movement. Does that mean that any kind of new land, or not new land, but land that's been sold or given, donated to tribes, would that then, again, not really be owned by the tribes?
So, yeah, the land back a really good question. Land back movement, the idea of trying to return land or land ownership in some form to tribal nations. It really depends on how the tribe wants to receive that land. So tribal nations as entities, as polities, can own fee land just like any individual nowadays. That land, however, is not in a position for them to exercise full sovereignty over. They exercise authority over it like a private landowner does. But it is still taxable. That's the primary thing. It's still taxable per the local and state governments. A lot of the time, tribes will put land in a trust, but it is a very arduous process to do so. Sometimes it's a minimum of 2 years to do so because of the process that the Department of Interior has created to take that land into trust for a tribe. And so that comes with a lot of associated costs of needing to maintain that land while that process is happening. And therefore, sometimes tribes, depending on what their finances look like, might actually refuse to take legal possession of a piece of property if it's not in their interest at that time to hold on to it until they could put it in a trust. Other than that, though, a tribe might receive land in another way, through establishing trust land and then having like a reservation declaration put on, or a tribe might buy that land and they want to hold it. An individual tribal member might buy that land, and then later they, upon their death, or if they want to sell it, the tribe will have right of first buy to reclaim that, especially if it's within the reservation boundaries. So it really just depends on what the tribe wants to do with land that is offered, as part of like land back movement initiatives.
Right. Well, can we get a round of applause again for Kyle? Kyle, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Alrighty, folks, that will conclude our program tonight. So have a good night, drive safe, and we will see you next time. Thank you.